Yeah, so I'm going to step outside the water box a bit more. And as Manu said, I'll be talking about. So I'm at Columbia. That's the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, and you might recognize Seinfeld restaurant. We were right above there. And so, yeah, I'm going to try and cover some key issues related. We heard about, Vijay mentioned the importance of water and agriculture, and so understanding water and food, and in fact the extremes of water and how that leads to potentially to famine is a key thing. And then also, so you have water to food. Food insecurity, we know, can in some cases lead to movement of people, migration, refugee movement, internal displacement. So just trying to get our heads wrapped around this and thinking about solutions, we want to think about, well, how can we move forward, and some of the tools, quantitative tools that we have to help advise policy. Of course, it does depend upon the environment, the political, social, economic environment that you're in. So we could have the best tools available, but if you have a government that's doesn't respect freedoms and individuals, then that can be a problem. So to follow on, what is the preeminent example of flooding and famine from Bruno's talk? I think the biggest example that came to mind was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322. From the chronologies that we see, there was persistent rain. So from the summer of 1314, it rained, hindered the wheat harvest. It continued, it had cold winters. Then in spring 1315, downpours started on Pentecost. And so if you go into these chronicles, you see, it's continuous rainfall in these regions. And then you see the area shaded there in Europe is Northern Europe, maybe not all the way out into, I guess, Ukraine and Russia area, but certainly Northern Europe and England and Ireland experienced severe famine. So there's a flooding story here. And our colleagues put together the Old World Drought Atlas, Ed Cook up at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and colleagues. And so they went and looked for a signal. Do we see this in the tree rings? And so this sort of reconstruction of the Palmer Drought Severity Index, they do seem to find a signal. Interesting thing, though, I did look at the longer time series, and it seems there are other time periods where, well, we had more flooding. But this was consecutive, so that's part of the story. But there is a socioeconomic dimension here. So Bruce Campbell, I think he's from Belfast, or was a professor in Belfast, a famous historian that knows all the details of the Great Famine. He's been looking into all the different aspects. So one aspect is this environmental story. But then there's also a story of weak institutions, weak welfare, a social story, also a population. Population had increased into the 1300s. So he asked many questions in a recent talk at Trinity College Dublin. Is it a Malthusian view with weak social institutions? Is it a view of socioeconomics? Is it a climate story? It's probably a complex story. I think that's sort of his suggestion. I guess we're not surprised by that, but I think sometimes we get sort of tunnel vision and we think, oh no, this is a flooding story or an extreme story, a climate extreme story. So I think it's an interesting perspective. And so one of the things I think we can learn from these historical events, we can understand how society reacts to different extremes in the water cycle. And talking about extremes, I think Bruno mentioned this, or sort of the extremes that happen rarely. And some of the extremes that we're concerned about are related to volcanic eruptions. And one of the most recent and famous is the Tambora eruption of 1815, which led to the year without a summer, which affected the northern hemisphere mostly, and led to the last sort of large-scale famine, environmentally produced famine in I guess, England and northern Europe. So that was linked, that eruption led to shifts in the hydrologic cycle and temperature anomalies that led to famine. But we see other events. So the Laki eruption of 1783 led to global disruptions. So famines, Europe, Egypt, India, China, Japan. So major events, major extremes that we need to be concerned about. So I came across this quote from this book, Bad Year Economics, by Halstead and O'Shea from 1989, and they said, well, hazards such as dormant volcanoes may operate as limiting factors so rarely that they can be ignored by human populations. Okay, but such hazards can be and regrettably are coped with by the ability of human fertility to compensate for occasional catastrophic mortality. So that's not ideal, right? I don't think we want to be in that place. I think we should be aware of these extreme rare events and have mechanisms to do our best and to reduce at least mortality. And this, you might have come across this quote, but by Amartya Sen. This reminded me of this. So he said, blaming nature can, of course, be very consoling and comforting. Comfortable inaction is, however, typically purchased at a very high price, a price that is paid by others, often with their lives. There's no real evidence to doubt that all famines in the modern world are preventable by human action. Now, I'm sure there's some extreme right that would lead to famine, and if it's a very large event. But by and large, the famines of the 20th century, the large ones, are either caused by government or could have been prevented and weren't. So I think this is an important point that, especially with sort of the climate challenges that we're facing, there's a risk of a climate to be blamed for an event when actually it's failed policy or poorly designed policy, which brought me to this book, Tombstone, the Great Chinese Famine. This was written by Yang Jisheng he had a longer version, 2-volume version in 2008, and they translated, thankfully, into English, and they reduced the scope. But what this gives you is the human story of how the government, the Mao, they failed to protect. So this is in the aftermath of the Great Leap Forward, where there was this tremendous pressure to transform agriculture, and as a result, there was this pressure to show that agricultural production was very high, and then there was the requirement that different communities provide food to the central government. So this is an amazing story. I recommend this for anybody who is working on food system and food system transformations, that we understand the risks associated with large-scale transformations by a centralized government that's disconnected from the communities. So in this recent case, the Chinese famine, what we saw was a lack of our historical strategies to cope with famine. So generally you have exchange, you have enhanced trade for food access, mobility, people will move out of a region, diversification, and storage. These are the 4 historical strategies. In the case of the Chinese famine, mobility was restricted. The government did not allow people to move outside of those regions, and we didn't have increased trade. In fact, the procurement requirements were increased, so trade was increasing out. Other examples where this happened was the Bengal famine of 1943, where the British government continued to have exports leaving the region. The same thing in the Irish famine of 1845, exports continued. So when we think of coping, we want food to come in these historical cases, recent historical cases of famine, we saw food continue to leave. And sometimes, in the case of the Irish famine, 1 million people perished, but 2 million people did leave. They moved outside long distances. In the Bengal famine, people moved internally within India, mostly. So that's sort of, it's important to understand those connections with these type of events. The water story here, I guess I was talking too much on these other slides, so I should go quickly. But this is a paper we had a couple of years ago, was looking at groundwater depletion. So Vijay was talking about trade of water. And this is specifically non-renewable groundwater. So you see the link with crops. So wheat, rice, maize, sugarcane, fodder grasses. The pie charts are the groundwater depletion of non-renewable groundwater by country. So the larger the size of the pie, the more non-renewable groundwater depletion there is. And so we put together, we want to say, okay, well, what is the impact on trade? And so what you can see here is, just in the interest of time, I don't have time to go through this in detail, but we see like Pakistan, the US, and India are exporting its non-renewable groundwater. We see two-way ties between the United States and Mexico, but this is of non-renewable groundwater. So of any of our groundwater resources that you're using, the most concern is about non-renewable groundwater. So does it make sense to use it for trade? If you have, that's a very limited resource. How do you want to use that water is a question. And depends if it's supporting your economic system. We know it's non-renewable, so there's some finite amount that you have. So you have to make an informed decision on what to do with that. I mean, in the context of the sort of big picture, with connecting the non-renewable groundwater with global hunger, we have a major problem with global hunger. It's increased to 345 million, up from 200 million just a few years ago. So things are exacerbated. And then you see, from the previous figure, we see that Afghanistan and Pakistan are places with major depletion of non-renewable groundwater. So there's some overlap here. But also, we know because of connections through trade, it doesn't have to be sort of a localized issue to have impact. So we see disruptions to agricultural production because of loss of non-renewable groundwater. We know other countries outside of these regions will be impacted through trade. So this is a major concern. So I'm just going to very briefly go through some of the tools that we have. I think Bruno was talking about having new tools to do scenario analysis. And so that's the idea behind the suite of tools that we've been trying to develop. These are on migration. With Manu, we've done some work on Bayesian multi-level modeling. There's network methods to analyze the movement of food. That's for sort of migration modeling. At a shorter time scale, smaller spatial scale, you'll have refugee modeling. We have an agent-based model to do that. And there's also evacuation modeling. So these are some of the tools that you can have to get a sense of how people move and do scenario analysis. And this is an example of the flea model. It's been used for a number of these regions to simulate refugee movement. And we have a proposal into NSF. We'll see, hopefully this works out. But this is the idea, well, we're going to use Bayesian inferencing on some of our various models to try and understand, to provide better insights and to help improve our knowledge of how people move in response to different drivers. This includes both soft infrastructure and hard infrastructure. But using these quantitative approaches to have better insights. On the food system side, we have a number of models. The Ukraine conflict, we were looking at scenarios for wheat prices, and this was, we had concerns about the Black Sea region. I'm really running low on time, so just to show an example, we looked at international agitation scenario where we had estimate of changes in prices and the countries potentially impacting their supplies. My colleagues at Potsdam Institute for Climate Research have an improved model now where they've broken down into different regions to understand the dynamics. So this new model is called Aggramate. It includes irrational policy interventions. It includes national storage reserves, and the trade network. So these are the sort of powerful tools that we can use to move forward. Other network analysis, network science, this understanding the connectivity of countries in the global, understanding communities and how they vary by different commodity. These are important things. And then transportation and logistics choke points. We know there was a disruption to the the Red Sea, and the Houthi rebel group's been shooting at some of the cargo ships. That's a potential choke point in the transportation of food and other commodities. And then this was a great study by a group at University of Oxford where they look at risk at global ports being key infrastructure for the movement of food and other commodities. So bringing together all these tools, we want to have more efficient systems and resilient. And it depends on the time scale. There's a lack of time to go into this, but depending upon your time scale, efficiency and resilience can work together or they can be in tension. And so we have to think about moving forward with some of these modeling tools to help inform decision makers with these tools. And I think we still need some better work. Oh, this got a little shifted, but understanding the connection between food insecurity and migration. We've done some good work with David Griffith on the processes that could be impacted by food prices and hydrology. And we have a paper on migration theory in climate mobility research to look at the theories of migration. So I think there's a lot of potential. I'll end with, it is very much a human story. We have, really tremendous responsibility here. So from the Great Irish Famine, this was with a potato blight, led to crop failure. But the trade connection is that food exports continued, as I mentioned before, because you didn't have local representation or skin in the game, I should say, of the government, resulted in approximately 1 million deaths and mass emigration. And there's a famous song that's very famous in Ireland. It's called "The Fields of Athenry," and it goes, "By a lonely prison wall, I heard a young girl calling, 'Michael, they've taken you away, for you stole Trevelyan's corn, so the young might see the morn. Now a prison ship lies waiting in the bay.'" So Trevelyan was a British administrator who didn't have a very positive view of the Irish, but he was trying to help. And so he imported corn from the United States, brought it to Ireland, but the mills couldn't, the grain was too hard for the Irish mills. So you had the corn sitting there, and this is sort of the story about someone who stole the corn and then was taken to prison to Botany Bay. And it says, "Low lie the fields of Athenry, where once we watched the small free birds fly. Our love was on the wing, we had dreams and songs to sing, so lonely around the fields of Athenry." So there's that human connection, right? And I think, you read the human impacts of famine, bad policy, failed policies. It's connected to water resources. We're here about complexity, right? Water, food, migration. So yeah, lots to do. I think there's lots of great ideas around the room. And thanks for having me. Thanks.